Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are, whenever you are. Welcome to this webinar style video, which is about building backup belays. My name is Steven van der Leden. Contents of this video, I'm going to give you a short introduction, then I'm going to define for you what exactly I mean by a backup belay. And after that we're going to have a look at 3 different scenarios to apply this. First of all, in a situation where we have 2 bolts or a single U-bolt connected to a ring. Second, where you have to make a backup belay with 2 bolts. And third of all, when you are doing a belay stance on a single natural anchor. These are the situations which you can encounter at Cerro Cabrito, which in Curaçao right now is the only bolted multi-pitch environment. So first off, for a short introduction, if you are watching this video, you are probably involved in one of my rock climbing courses, either an advanced or an expert level 1, involving a multi-pitch component. This webinar video is not meant as a substitute for formal climbing instruction or training. It is only to support that and to give you something that you can review later on to refresh your knowledge. And it has to be like that because with a video, I can only do a one-way communication. I can send the information your way. Exercising the skills that are involved is of course something else. Last but not least, if you are seeing any climbing material brands or something like that, a choice to show certain brands or not to show other brands has not been inspired by sponsoring, just so you know. Okay. Let's first off start by defining what exactly is a backup belay. Now, to understand the belay, first of all, we need to define what it is. The belay stance in multi-pitch climbing is, let's say, a halfway station or something that you do at the top of the rock to make sure that the second can come up safely and that your second can actually continue lead climbing or that you can continue lead climbing on. So it is a place where basically you fix yourself to the rock. In the past, we were often using pieces of protection for this, which were strong but perhaps not too much so. In the picture over there you see, for example, 2 nuts to the left and the right, and in the middle there you see a python or a peg, which has also been involved as a part of this belay stance. We were also always, of course, looking for strong pieces of protection if possible, but you have to deal with the situation that you are given, considering the rock and quality of the protection that already has been placed. Therefore, we also want to be redundant. In a belay stance, you don't want to be dependent on a single piece of protection if possible. There are exceptions to this, but if you can, you want to make sure that there's redundancy. And if we are redundant, then also we want to make sure we equalize. And what we mean by that is that if there's a load, we want to distribute the load over the different pieces of protection. We want to avoid a situation where one of these pieces of protection is loaded with everything and the other 2 are doing nothing. Then also what we want to do is we want to make it non-extendable. And what we mean by that is that if one of the pieces of protection fails, that the remaining pieces of protection are not shock loaded. This is something that could happen if you use the traditional approach with the sliding axe. This was a method which could result in a situation where if one of the pieces of protection would fail, you would get a shock load onto the rest, which would of course not be good if your belay stance was marginal already to begin with. And finally, there's also something to consider with the angle if you're equalizing. The angle between the pieces of protection needs to be as small as possible, because the bigger the angle, the less optimal the distribution of load is. Now, this is a system which can still be used today and which has also, applications in many situations, for example, where there are no modern bolts available. However, in many sport climbing environments nowadays, what we use is modern drill-in bolts. And for these modern drill-in bolts, they are of such a quality and such a strength that actually the whole thing with equalization is no longer really necessary. So what we do then instead is that we're saying, okay, we let go of the equalization. We are simply taking one piece of protection as the primary one. That is the one that we load. And there's a second one connected to it, but it's a backup. So it doesn't really get any load, but it's simply there to make the whole system redundant. because again, we still want a redundancy. If we are losing the equalization, the nice thing is that we are also losing the angle. The extendability we still want to consider if at least we can. That's why it's between brackets. And if you look at the picture to the right there, you can see that somebody's made an effort to actually take care of this by making sure that the sling in the carabiner to the right has a clove hitch to make sure that it's tight, that there's no unneeded slack in the system. And this system here, so with one bolt that takes all the load and a second one that is connected to it as a backup, that's what I refer to as a backup belay. Let's have a look at a couple of terms and definitions. First of all, in this belay stance we have pieces of protection, in this case 2 bolts. If you are multipitch climbing and you're reaching a place where there's 2 bolts close to each other, normally we refer to that as an anchor, because that is meant as either the end of the route where you belay or a halfway station or something like that. If you look at what's been built, then you'll see that there's carabiners and a sling, and there's also a nice loop in the sling over there, which we refer to as a central point. The central point is basically where we attach everything. This can be a carabiner, or in this case it's a loop in the sling. And of course the whole thing together, that's what we refer to as a belay stance or a belay station. So that's the location, you, your equipment and the bolts together. Let's have a look for a moment at the situations that you can encounter at Zero Cabrito, because that's also what set the contents of this video. There's basically 3 situations possible. The first situation is that you are encountering a ring, which is either connected to 2 bolts or 1 U-bolt. The second scenario is where you're dealing with 2 bolts that are not connected to each other. And the third and last scenario is where you're dealing with a natural anchor. This is something that you will have a couple of times at Zero Cabrito as well. We're going to start with the left situation where there's a ring, because that is the simplest situation. So let's have a look at how to make a backup belay using a ring. I've actually tried to simulate this situation in my home climbing wall, and of course in reality you have climbing materials, it looks slightly different, but I hope that you see what the idea is. So you have 2 bolts and they have been connected together to a central point, in this case a quick link, and that is basically that quick link, that is the thing that you want to work with. So what do you do if you come up? First of all, you need to connect yourself to this central ring which is in here. And in this case I'm doing that with 2 screw gate carabiners. The top one is my central point, that's where everything is attached to. And the bottom one over there you can see I have my self belay. My self belay in this case with a clove hitch or an hele mastworp. Very nice method. There's of course also the possibility to use a lifeline with a sling. Now you are at the top, you are now safe, so you call out that to your belayer, you take in the rope until there's no rope left, and then you prepare for a belay. You can do that for example with a Munters or an Italian hitch, which is a really nice lightweight approach of belaying, in the sense that it doesn't require you to have a belay device, and it is also a very versatile approach. An alternative way of course would be to use in this case an ATC guide or a Reverso XP or something like that in guide mode. Now, as I said before, there's a possibility of course also, like I'm showing in the picture to the left there, to use a sling instead of the rope to make your self belay. Now let's compare these 2 methods to each other. So clove hitch versus sling. What's the pros of the clove hitch? Well, first of all, it requires less gear. It saves you 1 sling. Because remember, the rope is already there. You're climbing on the rope. So if you use the rope for your self belay as well, you don't need to use a sling for that. Another pro is that it's very easy to extend or make shorter. And it doesn't come in plateaus like with a sling. You could double a sling to make it shorter. But if you're using a clove hitch with the rope, you can exactly take the distance that you like. Another pro is that it's always dynamic. So in this case you are always on a dynamic rope. So it means that if you would walk a little bit around on the belay stance and you would fall, you would still be on a dynamic rope, which is different of course from a sling, which is static. There's also a con. A clove hitch is not something that you should use if you're going to rappel from these belay stands. Because remember, the clove hitch is going into the rope, and you won't be able to use the rope if you are using a self belay from it. So you will need to have a self belay which is independent from the rope if you're going to use the rope for a rappel. And that's basically it about making a backup belay on a ring, regardless of whether that ring is attached to 2 bolts or 1 U-bolt. Next up, let's have a look at how to make a backup belay using 2 bolts. And we're first going to start with a situation with a basic setup using a short sling. Then after that I'm going to show you a couple of alternatives to inspire, basically with a long sling, quick draws, and a sling with a bowline. And finally, last but not least, I'd also like to show you a lightweight a method which requires not too much gear using the rope. Before we do anything else, we first need to consider how the bolts are positioned to each other. You can see 2 examples here, one to the left and one to the right. To the left you can see that the 2 bolts, they are positioned to each other vertically. So there's a very clear top bolt and a very clear bottom bolt. In the example to the right you can see that the bolts are next to each other, and that is actually what you will see in Zero Cabrito. If you are in the situation where the bolts are, there's one top bolt and there's one bottom bolt, what you will do normally is that you use the bottom bolt as a central point. And the whole idea of that is that you want to avoid unwanted extension. In other words, we have 2 bolts, there's a backup on the top bolt, and it means that if the bottom bolt fails, there's not going to be too much extension. In the situation to the right, it is not really possible to avoid that problem. So whichever bolt you choose, left or right, there's always going to be unwanted extension to the system. So you have a little bit more freedom to choose in that sense. And therefore you can consider other factors. For example, how big the belay stance is. Can you walk around, or is it a small ledge? The group size, how many climbers are there? Where are you coming from? In other words, if you're going to belay a second, where is that person coming from? Where is the route going to go next? Who leads the neck pitch, etc., etc. Those are then factors that will determine which bolt you will choose for the central point. Now, let's assume for a moment we're going to do the right situation, because that's the more complex one and also the one that you will encounter at Zero Cabrito, like I said. You get to the top there, and first of all what you do is you put 2 screw gate carabiners into one of these bolts. That will be your central point, and attached to that is your lifeline, which is your self belay in this case. Next up, we're going to connect them to each other. In this case I'm doing that with a sling and a carabiner. And you might argue that if it goes for the principle of a backup belay, we've already accomplished the goal. The 2 bolts are connected to each other. There is redundancy in that sense. The only thing is, however, in this case it's not optimized, because if the left bolt is going to fail, it means there's going to be more of a shock load onto that right bolt than is needed. Why? Because there's slack in the system. So we want to have a look at a way to eliminate the slack from the system. And one way to do that is to use 2 clove hitches to make basically the sling go tight in one area. You might argue that it's better actually to take the piece of sling that doesn't have the stitching, but okay, this should not really be a problem. So what happens in this case? You can see that in one place the sling is going tight. And let's focus for a moment on that carabiner to the left over there. You can see that clove hitch. Please note, it's been positioned at the top of the carabiner, and the reason for this is because you have to keep in mind, if that left bolt is going to fail, it's going to be an extreme scenario. So we're talking full factor 2 or something like that. That is something that would make it fail. In that scenario, you put the clove hitch at the top of the carabiner to make sure that the carabiner is loaded across its long axis, which is the strongest. And remember, in a situation where your anchor would fail, there's a good chance that your carabiner would fail if it's cross-loaded. So that's why we put the clove hitch there at the top of the carabiner. On the other side is a clove hitch as well. Please note that this is a normal snapper, so it's not a screw gate carabiner. This is acceptable for making a backup anchor, so you don't necessarily need to have a screw gate carabiner for the top one. However, what we do want to make sure in that scenario is that if that left bolt fails and everything comes down, we want to make sure that the gate of that snapper is not pressed open against anything. That is why in this case you can see that the opening of the carabiner is to the left side, because the whole thing is going to rotate to the right in case that left bolt is going to fail. And that's it for a basic setup to connect two bolts to each other with a backup belay. And you see that, you know, the whole thing with the clove hitch is really to avoid the problem that there's going to be unwanted extension in the system in case one of the pieces of protection fail, which, to be honest, you know, you're not thinking that will happen, because otherwise you would use an equalized anchor, of course. You are trusting these bolts. But still, you know, you want to make sure that in the unlikely scenario that one of the bolts is going to fail, that there's not going to be too much stress on the other piece of protection. Next up, we're going to have a look at a couple of alternatives for the basic setup that I just explained to you. And the first method to do that is to use a long sling. Remember, in the basic setup I showed you what you can do with a short sling. If you have a longer sling, there's a couple of things that you can do. In this case, for example, it is using a clove hitch again to connect a sling to another piece of protection, but in this case we're using a double sling. Please note that clove hitching a sling like this, in this case you can see on the top there is a clove hitch, but you also see that the end of the sling is clipped into the main point over there, the central point. Why is this? This sling, particular sling, is a Dyneema sling, and Dyneema has been known to slip under large tension. So what you want to make sure is you want to avoid the problem that it's going to slip basically out of the knot, and that's why you clip the end into the central point over there. What's the pros and the cons if you compare to the situation with the short sling? Well, first of all, of course, in this situation you are not using one strand of sling, but you're using two strands of sling to hold everything, which means that you're getting added strength. And the only con really is that, of course, it requires you to have a longer sling in this case. Always keep in mind though, you know, if you're doing this, you're making a backup belay and using slings, you always want to keep in mind that the bolts, you know, they can be close to each other, but they can also sometimes be a little bit further from each other. So if you're choosing to buy a sling, let's say, for this purpose, I would definitely, for example, choose a 120 centimeter one over a 60 centimeter one every day. Another alternative is to use quick draws. So what if you don't have a sling, for example, and you still want to make a backup anchor? Well, this is an acceptable way of working as well. So this is basically somebody who comes to the top and uses quick draws to make a connection between the backup bolt and the main bolt. Couple of pros and cons for this. The pros, of course, is that it doesn't require you to have any slings, so that's very nice. So it means if you don't have that material, you can still do this safely. However, there's also, of course, a con, and that is that in this case, you know, there's limited options to avoid extension. Why? Because the quick draws are having a fixed length, so it is not really possible, like with a sling, for example, to adjust it to a certain length. And finally, I would like to show you a solution where we're using a sling with a bow line, as we call it, and that is this situation over here. So what's happening in this situation, you can see on the top there is a clove hitch again to make sure that that sling is tight. Again, if you can do this in a double sling, it's better, of course, but I think probably it was a little bit too short in this situation. That's why I've done it with a single strand. Then to the left there you can see a bow line, which then has created that loop that you can see within the yellow circle. And that is something which is really particular about this specific method. Pros and cons of this method. The main reason I think to do this is because you can supersize your central point. That thing with the yellow circle before is all available for your central point. So if you are a big group, for example, it can be very useful actually to do this, because then you have a lot of space, let's say, within that loop of the sling, much more than in a single carabiner, for example. There's also a disadvantage. Disadvantage, of course, is that it requires you again to have a long sling, just like with the first alternative. Finally, I would like to show you how to make a backup belay with the rope. So in this case, we arrive at the belay stance, and what we do is that we basically clove hitch ourselves into the one of the bolts. Clove hitch, because remember, I'm using just a rope, so I want to use minimal gear in this case on the belay stand, so I'm just using the rope and nothing else. So I'm not going to use a lifeline with a sling, I'm just clove hitching myself with a screw-rate carabiner into one of the bolts. Please note there's no central carabiner in this case either. Normally what I've done so far is always I've clipped 2 screw-gate carabiners into the bolt, and I fixed myself to the bottom one to make sure that I was belayed. Why am I not doing this now? Well, because the rope is now used as a part of the belay system, it means it's going to be probably not very easy for me to escape anyway if I want to, because I'm still fixed on the rope. Of course, if I have the carabiners, I would probably, use a central point anyway. However, this particular setup also gives me another advantage that I will highlight later on. Okay, I've put myself to one of these pieces of protection, and then what I can do is I can fix myself to the second one as well, using a clove hitch again. And the nice thing about clove hitch again, of course, is that I can adjust it. And then finally, when I'm ready to take up my second, I can simply put an HMS carabiner into my self-belay in this case and belay the second up. Now, a couple of things about this that I would like to highlight. First of all, again, there's clove hitches here. There's also this Munters or this Italian hitch over there to give the belay again. An advantage of this setup is that even though, the belay of the second is now a part of my belay system as the person who was at the belay stance, the nice thing is that you can see that Italian hitch, that Munters hitch on the bottom there, doesn't rub off against anything. And if you remember the setup that I showed you before, where we have a central point, and inside that central point there's a carabiner for your self belay, and next to it there's a Munters hitch. The problem is that the Munters hitch sort of rubs against your clove hitch, and that is a little bit hard because it's going to make it a little bit harder to take in the rope. Now, a couple of pros and cons over here. First of all, if you're doing rope versus sling, the main advantage, of course, is that you're required to use less gear. You can see over here that, it only takes you 3 screw-gate carabiners to do this. However, there's also cons. For example, first of all, of course, it's going to be difficult to escape the system in case of emergency. And also, because your self-belay is a part of the belay stance, it means that the second climber must be the leader of the next pitch, because otherwise you will have to reconstruct your belay stance. Last but not least, we're going to have a look at how to make a belay stance using a single natural anchor. And this is a situation that you will sometimes encounter when doing outdoor climbing on Curacao. There's 2 kinds of natural anchors that you'll use on Cerro Cabrito. To the left over there you can see that summit cairn, which basically is a thing made out of concrete. Of course, a summit cairn constructed out of loose stones is not something you'd ever want to use as a belay station. But if it's made of concrete and it's pretty sturdy, then it's something that you could consider to use. Of course, you always have to inspect these things and see whether you trust them, yes or no. Another possibility is the one to the right over there, which is a tunnel feature, or a zandloper in Dutch, which basically is a thing that you can thread a piece of rope or a sling through, and that is then something that you can also use as an anchor. I would like to focus predominantly on the summit cairn over there, and I've simulated this by putting a bucket on its back, because this is a similar situation. Now, normally if you would create a belay stance of this, what you would do, of course, is you would throw a sling around it, and on that sling you would put your central point and then also a munter's hitch to do a belay. This is risky, however. I would not advise you to do this. Why? Because the summit cairn is at the same height as where you are as a belayer. So you want to make sure that you take some kind of measure to avoid the whole system from coming up and flipping over the top. And one way to do that is to basically sling the entire thing a second time with an additional loop. And that makes the risk of the whole thing coming undone because you stand up a little bit smaller. What I've done basically there is that picture to the left over there, so you see that there's an additional loop in the sling to make sure that it doesn't come off. To the right over there is something we call a gurf hitch or a lark's foot, an ankersteek in Dutch. If you have enough sling to accomplish this, this is always better, of course, because it's going to make the risk of the whole thing flipping off even smaller. There's, however, one disadvantage to this approach is that it counts as a knot, so it will take away from the strength of your equipment. That is the only drawback of this, really. And something like this, ankersteek, gurf hitch, lark's foot, is also something that you can use if you're slinging, again, a tunnel feature, especially if your sling is not really long enough, or you want to extend it a little bit. So that's something you could also do. Of course, if you are slinging a tunnel feature, what you can simply do is put a sling through it, and on both ends of the sling you just put a screw gate carabiner through it, and then you're pretty much finished as well. That's it for me for this video. If you have any questions, just let me know. climbing@bluepinnacle.com. And thank you for your attention. And of course, now let's climb.